My name's James and I paint minis.
This is Spoontastic Minis. In the first part of this video you saw how to apply greys to a miniature in order to paint the dark, medium and light areas of the model according to where you think the light falls. Now we're going to paint a transparent colour over that to show you how pre-shading is actually supposed to work. As you can see here, this is a later stage of painting the greys and it is much lighter and much more shaded and highlighted. So this is where we're at. We've got the Space Marine and the base shaded. We're going to use Evil Sun Scarlet from the Games Workshop with Laherman Medium, also from the Games Workshop. Now, because this is going to be very transparent, we don't actually need terribly much paint. So I'm going to get a couple of dots of Evil Sun Scarlet and a whole lot of Laherman Medium and mix that in. And that actually gives us quite a lot of fairly transparent paint. First demonstrating on the base as I did before, so this is going on. This is a little bit more runny than I would ideally like, so I've probably used slightly too much medium in this, but you can see how it's going over the colours slightly differently. And now moving on, we're going to do a second coat, but I felt the first coat was a bit too runny, so now we're going to mix it slightly better. I'm going to use a pipette for the medium, so that there's 2 blobs of paint and 2 blobs of medium, and then it should be an exact mixture. So this will be a bit more precise and should be a bit better for what we're doing. It should show the colour rather better per coat of paint. Now we're going to use this mix. I found that it was a lot thicker, so I had a tiny bit of water to it as well. So unlike the previous mix, this has water as well as medium, but it's still thicker than the previous mix because there's a lot less medium. So you'll see it goes on more like a conventional paint, but it is still quite transparent. Now I'm leaving part of the base with just the first coat on so you can see the difference, and then once that's dry I'm going to apply a third coat, because although the second coat's okay, it's not perfect. Whereas I think a third coat pretty much finishes it off, so that looks rather good to my eye. Now how does that look on a miniature? So at the same time as I did the base, I actually did the marine, so this is that first mix, which was probably a bit too much medium, so it's going on more like a wash than a paint, but as long as it covers everything, it'll do. I don't like the way it appears to be making the recesses look really bright red, but that does tone down, as of course it's drying over black rather than any lighter colour. As you can see, I've slathered this over most of the model, just adding it to the shoulder pad and arm. This is much faster than painting on the greys because of course this mix is not only very runny, but also it just needs to go over the greys. It doesn't need to be particularly precise. In that sense, it's a bit more like using a contrast paint. Incidentally, I will be doing a video on contrast paints later. This is more what you can do with conventional paints. Now, I have to admit, at this stage it doesn't look particularly good, but this is only the first of what will end up being 3 coats, so bear with me. Now with that done, give it at least an hour, bearing in mind it will take longer to dry because it's got medium in it. And now we're going for the second coat. Now remember, this mix is a little bit thicker, it's got less medium in it, and so you need to be a little bit more selective about how and where you apply it. So here I am mainly focusing on the mid and lighter greys, though I will go over some of the darker greys as well if it seems appropriate. And of course in this way you can reinforce where you've applied the highlights, but you can also avoid areas that you feel should be darker. Now if you are watching this thinking, oh this is rubbish, you should have just used contrast paints, the main difference here is you have a lot more control doing this. If you were to use a contrast paint, you'd have one thick layer, and wherever it was thicker it would be essentially darker and more coloured in. Whereas this, you have full control over where the colour goes, where it's brighter, where it's darker, and where it is the most vibrant. Unlike the first coat, I am being a little bit more careful about this leg armour, mainly so that I don't get it in the recesses, because whilst I want those to be very dark red, I don't necessarily want them to get any brighter. So I'm just having to be careful painting around all these armour panels and omitting all of the gaps. Now, just as with the greys, to save a little bit of time on the video, I'm skipping ahead to where the majority of the model has had this second coat of red on it, and now we're just finishing off this shoulder guard and the remaining arm with the fingers pointing forwards in order to add some red in areas that need to be lighter. Now it's worth bearing in mind that whilst this coat does not have to be perfect, it will show through the third coat as well. So any errors here will show through, so it's all very well saying, oh, you don't have to be too perfect at this stage, you've got another coat to go. No, but any brushstrokes that are out of place will still show through this layer and the layer that's going to be painted on top of it. Now I think you can see around this elbow guard that some of the recesses are a little bit more red than I would like, but it is starting to equalise as I'm putting some more red paint on it, and you should find by the time we're actually done, it should look about right, whereas initially it kind of looked like I'd used a red wash in all of the recesses, which looked a little bit weird. While we're on the subject of recesses possibly having paint in them and maybe being brighter than they should be when they should be really dark, you are always allowed to use a paint or a wash in them to do what's generally known as panel lining to make those panel lines darker. Now with the fingertips, again, I'm just trying to omit the bits that are completely black. The rest of it is perfectly fine to paint all over. Just trying to make sure that we actually have some separation between each fingertip plate and the one before it. Now at this point the marine is starting to look more complete, and I suppose you could leave it here, but to my eye some bits are more consistently red than others, so whilst it's okay, it's not perfect. So my idea is to use a third coat so that areas such as the legs and shoulder guards and backpack are equalised with areas that seem to have slightly better coverage, such as the chest. And so that's what we're doing here, just starting that third layer, mainly focused on the lightest areas, but obviously going over some of the darker greys as well, so as to ensure that we actually have a nice even coverage. Now of course with this third coat on camera it's a little bit hard to see what I'm doing, because where it's wet it actually looks oversaturated, so it's actually hard to see that I've added colour, it just looks glossy. But you can see where I'm painting, and once it's dried and sort of muted down a little bit, it does look correct. So don't worry if it looks a little bit strange just for the moment on camera, it will look better when it's done, you'll see later in the video. Now this is the kind of area that I feel is a little inconsistent, where you can still see a big step between the ash grey and the storm vermin fur on the sort of shin armour. So I feel this is the kind of area where it's really worth adding a third coat. Some of the other areas such as the chest might not need it so much, but I'm still going to go over it slightly. But areas like the inside of the leg here do look a lot better once it's had the third coat. So again, it might seem like extra work, but I actually think it's worth it in the end. Okay, so with that part of the leg largely finished, we're going to skip ahead to where I've painted most of the model with the third coat, and I think you'll see that it is starting to look much more consistent. Most of it's actually dry now, so you can see what I meant. It is actually worth doing this third coat for completeness and consistency of colour. But we still need to do this shoulder pad, missing the area where there's obviously a shadow under the backpack, but we need to do the shoulder pad and the remainder of the arm for it to all look nice and consistent and have that nice coloration you're expecting, but also the light and dark areas because of the pre-shading greys that we did in the first part of the video. Now you will see me going over some of these areas quite briefly and then taking my time on other areas to go over and over and over. This is simply to ensure that the colours balance out, because like I say, that second coat seemed a little inconsistent compared to what I wanted. It may just be because it was the second of 3, but there are some areas where I felt maybe a little more colour was needed, and so I'm taking care to add those now, as I feel this is likely to be the last coat and there isn't going to be a 4th or 5th or anything like that. Now, one of the goals here, and one of the things you're probably noticing at this 3rd coat stage, is that I'm trying to improve the saturation of reds as well as the highlighting of them, if you will. So part of this is to make sure that these are nice, bright, vibrant parts of the model, but also that it has the nice saturated reds that we're all used to seeing as if these are achieved without any effort. But of course, we're used to seeing professionally painted models on social media as well, so there you go. But yeah, this gives us the nice saturated colours as we expect. But obviously, if you'd left it at the 2nd coat, it would be less saturated and perhaps a little more realistic looking. Whereas this is a little more in the slightly cartoonish style of a lot of models where it looks brilliant, but it's probably a little unrealistic. Alright, now we're finishing that up. I'm going to show you in a second what it looks like when it's dry. And I hope you'll see that it was worth doing, because you now have this nicely shaded and highlighted model, even though there's only really one colour painted over it. There you go. Doesn't look too bad, does it? Now, why did we do this? Why didn't we just use colours to shade and highlight? Well, here's a comparison with the yellow over white, grey and black that I did for the paint difficult colours, and here's the one that we did for the painting reds. You see how it's reds fully highlighted? Now I'm going to compare it with what you do when you shade and highlight with colours also on a base. So here we have our reds, and here we have layering fashion reds highlighted and shaded. You see how they fade into orange and brown.
Right, if you've watched this far, firstly, thank you for watching. I very much appreciate it. If you did like the video, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon to let you know when the next video will be coming out. I hope it will be soon.